What do you think of when I say the word emo? Do you think of straightened hair, eyeliner, skinny jeans? How about bands like My Chemical Romance and Fall Out Boy and Paramore? Or maybe something like modern baseball? Do you think of a vibe? You're so emo, you might say to your sad friend. And they probably
fucking hate you.
Or you might think of a vague concept of sincerity, heart on your sleeve lyricism, and ennui. Whatever you think emo is, you still think about it. Emo is a term that I think most people in 2025 know. It's kind of like punk in that way. You know it, even if you
don't know it.
But did you know there was a time when the term wasn't widely known? A time when it was more underground. Of course you didn't. That's why you're here. And where exactly is here? And who am I? Well, I am your emo historian, and this is your emo history lesson. Hello and welcome back to another video. If you're new here, I'm Trevor, and I am eternally uncool. I make videos about music, music culture, and anything that interests me. But mostly music right now. So if that sounds like something you'd be into, then I highly recommend subscribing to the channel and watching the rest of this video. In our previous lessons, we talked about emo's rise in the DC hardcore scene and the subsequent rise of bands like Jawbreaker and Sunny Day Real Estate in the mainstream. But that mainstream attention was kinda short-lived, as both bands struggled internally and eventually fell out of favor. But while the mainstream music media and music channels and journalists weren't talking about emo as much, the genre was slowly growing within several scenes across the United States. Emo still had its roots in the DIY ethos, with bands pretty much coming up organically and playing basement shows, promoting themselves, while also experimenting with different sounds that didn't really fit in with the heaviness of Fugazi or Rites of Spring. Many of these bands were inspired by the success of Jawbreaker and Sunny Day Real Estate. But as those bands got more attention, emo kind of retreated back and went underground again, which I think was a good idea, because it gave these bands in these different scenes more time to further perfect the genre into what it would eventually become. What I want to do today is take a look at the second wave of emo. My lighting feels dark. I personally think that this was one of the most important eras in emo's early development. The one many subsequent bands would take a lot of inspiration from. We're going to take a look at several bands that played a big part in emo's development during this time, their important albums, and the influence they would have on the genre as a whole. So grab a pencil, make sure to take notes.
There will be a test.
And let's get into another emo history lesson.
Okay, we're still getting the hang of this, putting our, stuff right. So we're Cap'n Jazz was hard.
If there's any band that's integral to the progression of emo moving forward, it has to be Cap'n Jazz. Formed by the Kinsella brothers, vocalist Tim and drummer Mike, the band would be sort of the nucleus for several other important emo bands of this era. Along with the Kinsella brothers, Cap'n Jazz also consisted of guitarist Mike Villarreal. Hey, this is editing Trevor here. His name isn't Mike, it's Victor, so I call him Mike throughout the whole segment. Just ignore that. I'm a fucking idiot. And Sam Zurich on bass. Eventually, they would add a second guitarist and vocalist, Davey Von Bohlen. All of them had met at high school in Illinois, and they all shared a love for skateboarding and music. You know, teenage boy shit. The name Cap'n Jazz really doesn't mean anything. It came about when the band was just brainstorming names, and for some reason Sam Zurich was eating Captain Crunch, and he just blurts it out. And the rest of the band must have liked it, so they went with Cap'n Jazz. Because Cap'n Crunch was probably trademarked. The band would draw influence from the previously discussed Fugazi, as well as adding a kind of math rock influence on guitar and bass. Along with this, they also added their own unique traits. Tim Kinsella was kind of a weird singer for the time. He would kind of jump between singing and shouting, adding a little bit of spoken word here and there. His lyrics were also really enigmatic and surreal. He stated he wrote them while on mushrooms for the first time. Their sound was actually really chaotic and artsy for a Midwest punk band. Tim Kinsella would even go as far as to label the band's sound weirdo punk. They would release 2 EPs between forming in 1989 and their debut album in 1995. The first one was called, I'm gonna have to read it off of the laptop because it's just so stupid long. Sometimes you can stand so close to something you cannot tell what you are looking at. Released in 1993. The second one has a much shorter title. It's called Boys 16 to 18 and that was released in 1993. Both these EPs showcase a sound that was really unique, something we haven't heard in emo up to this point. Yes, there was a clear post-hardcore and punk rock influence, but none of the bands we've discussed in previous lessons were quite as mathy as Cap'n Jazz. Cap'n Jazz really set themselves apart with their sound. In 1995, Cap'n Jazz released their debut album and only album, which fans often refer to as Schmappin' Schmazz. They call it that because the actual title is Burritos, Inspiration Point, Fork Balloon Sports, Cards and Sporks, Automatic Biographies, Kites, Kung Fu, Trophy, Banana Peels we've slipped on, and Eggshells we've tippy-toed over. Yeah, that's the actual title of the album. I don't know what was up with these guys. Honestly, a title that long would make me mad, but this album is so good that it makes up for it. I'm dying to tell you I'm dying. Despite being a very unique and interesting band, all was not well within Cap'n Jazz. Sam Zurich and Mike Villarreal were both abusing substances, with Villarreal being the worst of the two. The rest of the band would try to intervene, but nothing worked. And when I say Villarreal was bad, I mean he was bad. Apparently, after one of their shows, he was seen pissing all over himself and the band's equipment. Hey, you know what? We've all been there. I'm not here to judge. You have one too many Heinekens, and that kick drum starts to look like a toilet.
These things happen.
Another less funny example is when he had to be rushed to the ER because he had a non-fatal Ritalin overdose. At this point, the band didn't know what to do. Tim and Davey suggested canceling the rest of their shows. Mike and Sam suggested breaking up. Ultimately, they would go with both options. They broke up, and that pretty much canceled the tour itself. So much like Rites of Spring and Jawbreaker before them, Cap'n Jazz had a short career, but a huge impact. The band would reissue their EPs and albums into an anthology in 1998. It's called an alphabet apology. That's the third take. I'm not doing it a fourth time. You can't make me. Critics will call this the holy grail of emo. They pretty much invented the sound of Midwest emo as we know it. Every stereotype you can trace back to these guys. Without them, we wouldn't have bands like Algernon Cadwallader or Snowing. Cap'n Jazz and their work pretty much kicked off 90s emo, in my opinion. They took the sound of bands like Rites of Spring and Jawbreaker and added their own little touches to it, bringing in more of an indie rock style as opposed to just straight hardcore and punk. They made it more intricate and mathy, and the lyrics were much weirder and interesting. They really pushed emo into a new direction, one that would influence generations to come. And the members of Cap'n Jazz would continue to influence emo as they splinter off into their own separate bands, like our next entry. The Promise Ring came about after the demise of several bands, Cap'n Jazz just being one of them. The group has its roots in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, being founded in 1995 by guitarist Jason Newikow and Matt Mangan, who had both been in a band called None Left Standing. They teamed up with drummer Dan Didier and bassist Scott Bechta, who had been in a band called Celeshrine. However, Mangan would move to Indianapolis shortly after the band formed, leaving an open space for a singer and guitarist. Newikow decided to invite his friend, Davey Von Bohlen, to be in the band, and thus The Promise Ring was born, and emo would never be the same. The Promise Ring's sound is drastically different from that of Cap'n Jazz. Whereas Cap'n Jazz was kind of more hardcore leaning and mathy, The Promise Ring had more of a power pop and indie inspired sound. They took more influence from the melodic punk bands of the 70s and 80s, rather than just solely citing Rites of Spring and Embrace. And I think this really helped to distinguish them. They released a demo, an EP, and a split between forming in 1995 and 1996. And these releases really showed The Promise Ring's signature sound early on. The poppiness mixed with the vulnerable lyrics and Davey Von Bohlen's unique vocal style. These releases would impress fellow emo acts, Texas Is the Reason, who would pass them on to Jade Tree Records. Jade Tree wasn't really impressed with what they heard, but they would see the band play live anyway. After seeing them live though, Jade Tree was impressed, promptly signing them to the label. See, kids never give up. On Jade Tree, they would release their debut album, 30 Degrees Everywhere, which they recorded in just 5 days. 5 days! That's a work week. The band is quoted as saying that they didn't know what they wanted the album to be or how they wanted it to come out, which is kind of refreshing in my opinion when you hear so many bands who come out and say, we want to make something different, something no one has heard before. And it's just like a pop punk album with violins. I like that The Promise Ring was just like,
we don't fucking know.
In fact, the whole recording of this album was kind of a mess. Von Bohlen was sick, so he had a lot of trouble with his vocals. The studio only had enough mics to record the guitars. The album was engineered by Chris Rice, who had just come off working with the band Tortoise. And he considered the Promise Ring album just a simple punk project. So there was a lot of miscommunication. They pretty much said they were recording at the wrong time with the wrong person. But despite all the problems during recording, the album came out surprisingly well. Critics would call the songs sharp and powerful while also being catchy. Andy Greenwald would write about the band in his own emo history, Nothing Feels Good, that the album was rough but winning. I honestly think this is one of the strongest debuts in emo. In fact, most of the Promise Ring's discography is pretty solid, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The album would actually sell out a gig at the legendary CBGBs. They'd go on a 6-week American tour and a 2-month tour of Europe, building up more and more hype and a following. And they would need this hype, because the next album they were set to release was going to be the album that made them legends within the genre of emo. After they toured Europe, The Promise Ring took a break to write their second album. No matter what genre you're in, your sophomore album is important. A strong debut can do a lot, but if the follow-up isn't as good, if not better, you're gonna have a problem. So The Promise Ring went about working on their second album the best way they knew how, by jamming out. This album's sound would drift more into power pop, whereas their debut still had a little bit of that Cap'n Jazz influence to it, and Von Bohlen would do more lyrically, incorporating geographical references and color references, like comparing his girlfriend to the color red in the song Red and Blue Jeans. As well as the song Is This Thing On, making reference to bands like Television and Air Supply, and the greatest state in the United States of America, Delaware. Nothing Feels Good would become the Promise Ring's opus. Critics praised the album's poppier sound, as well as the sentimentality and imagination of the whole thing. It was odd, but catchy. Davies' vocals were seen as a hindrance on their debut, but on this album they act as a distinguishing trait. And even traits critics saw as negative, like the excessive lyrics, would all still be things you see in emo moving forward. Nothing Feels Good would really go down as one of the most important emo albums of the 90s. Hell, of all time, really. I mentioned that Andy Greenwald's incredible history of late 90s and early 2000s emo was named after the album. But it would also go on to inspire bands like Taking Back Sunday and New Found Glory. The album has just become one of the blueprints for emo. The Promise Ring had a longer career than Cap'n Jazz, recording and releasing albums well into the 2000s, but I mainly wanted to look at the albums they released in the 90s, like the important stuff and the ones that would inspire emo moving forward chronologically. I feel like my previous lessons were kind of bogged down with me trying to tell a whole condensed history of the band and their entire discographies. It was just too much. The release and impact of Nothing Feels Good feels like a good place to stop on The Promise Ring for now. I would love to talk about their follow-up Very Emergency, which is my personal favorite Promise Ring album, but that'll have to wait for another video because we have one more band that spun off from Cap'n Jazz that we have to talk about today. After the dissolution of Cap'n Jazz, Tim and Mike Kinsella would go on to form the band Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was never as big as The Promise Ring or as legendary as Cap'n Jazz, but throughout their 25-year career, they've had a pretty good run of pretty solid indie rock. Tim Kinsella would be the only band member to be a constant throughout the band's entire career. It's kind of like his baby. Mike, on the other hand, would step in front of the drum kit and become a singer for his own band. American Football would come about from a high school friendship between Mike Kinsella and Steve Holmes. Throughout Cap'n Jazz's brief career, Mike and Steve would be roommates. And by 1997, Mike and Steve would form a band. They brought in other musicians named Steve Lamos, David Johnson, and Alan Johnson. The group was called The One Under the Stairs. I don't know what it means, but that was the name. The band would only release one 7-inch before quickly breaking up with their fists. But that didn't stop Kinsella, Lamos, and Holmes from trying again. The trio would form American Football, a band that would go on to be incredibly annoying to Google. American Football would retain much of the mathiness you saw in Cap'n Jazz, but in a less chaotic way. American Football really takes what their nucleus band was doing and adds a lot more to it. They kept the intricate and mathy guitars, but they slowed them down. They added elements of slowcore, dream pop, and indie rock, creating a really unique sound for the time. They released an EP in 1998 simply called American Football. Just FYI, we're gonna get this out of the way real quick. All of their albums are called American Football. The EP contained 3 songs that showcased the band's mathy brand of indie emo.
Age 13, already blasé, yeah. Broken hearted.
Then, in 1999, they released one of the biggest, not even emo albums, just albums in general. Let's just forget. Where's my fucking... American Football's 1999 debut album is probably one of the greatest, if not the greatest emo albums of the 90s. It was a minor success when it was first released, being played on college radio and receiving a pretty good score from Pitchfork. It wasn't anywhere near as big as Nothing Feels Good, but it was a pretty decent, moderate success.
But
After its release, years later, the album would become so much more. Many critics consider this album the foundation of what emo would become in the 2000s. It was almost the opposite of Rites in Spring and Embrace. Whereas those bands were hardcore and played kind of fast and heavy, American Football was more laid back and mellow and sad. And their lyrics were much more heart on your sleeve. Like, these were sincere, turned up to 11. Now, this album might not sound like what emo sounded like in 2003, but ask any member from any of those bands that were huge what one of their favorite albums was. They will say American Football's 1999 debut. I discovered this album when I was in college, and it completely changed my life. I discovered a lot of life-changing albums when I was in college, but this American Football album really had an impact on me. Not only does it open with the ultra memed Neverment, which is just like a hard-hitting song for anyone who's ever experienced love and loss and angst. But it continues with nostalgia-laced tracks like The Summer Ends, The Remorseful But the Regrets Are Killing Me, and The One with the Wurlitzer. This album is just iconic. From the sound of the album to the artwork itself. If you're a music fan, you recognize this house. It's the emo album. American Football really foretold the early sound of the emo explosion of the 2000s just a few short years before it happened. And they did it all with just this one album. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Emo's second wave remains highly influential. Bands like Cap'n Jazz, The Promise Ring, and American Football are just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many other bands that have influenced what emo is today. To capture the importance of the second wave's influence is just
impossible.
So what I'm gonna do is split this video into 2 parts, maybe 3. We'll see how I'm feeling. But I'm gonna split this video into 2 parts. The first half talking about Cap'n Jazz and the bands that spawned from it. And the second half we'll talk about bands from the 90s that weren't in Cap'n Jazz. The second wave of emo was its most important era. The one that would impact all others after it. So get ready to dive deeper into emo's golden era in our next lesson. Pencils down. The time for taking notes is over. Hope you weren't sleeping in class. Steve, did you learn something new today? Maybe I gave you some new bands to check out. Are you sick of these yet? Let me know in the comments. That's gonna do it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, then I highly recommend smashing that like button and sharing this video with everyone you know. I am a small, independent content creator who does everything on his own. So every like, every share, every comment, any interaction with my videos and posts really help me out a lot. So with all that being said, thank you for watching. As always, I'm Trevor. Stay uncool. And that's the end of the video. Goodbye.